topic is going to be the ultimate playbook for managing grants. Now, what we will be doing is we're going to share out some more comprehensive resources, things that we won't talk about today that really kind of gets deep into the playbook side of things. And the reason why I say that is the concept of a playbook is relatively large. We've done a lot of these conversations where we can start as early as like marketing tactics or website presence and things like that. But my goal today is to talk more about what I feel is the most important parts of a grant program, and that's kind of the nuts and bolts that when we wrap it up, we can say, yeah, this was a very successful program. So that includes everything from like the compliance side of things, the right way of collecting applications. If you're collecting external resources like reference requests or grant reporting templates, how do we do that? And then really what I feel is like the main point of this is going to be how do we conduct a thoughtful and comprehensive and compliant review and selection process that's both efficient for your team, but also much more importantly, is going to be the experience for the applicants and the review committee members and stakeholders and donors and sponsors and those people involved. Because at the end of the day, if we focus on the engagement aspect of things and focusing on them, everything else kind of falls into play. So kind of a quick introduction of who I am here at Reviewr. Ultimately, I've been doing this now for almost 12 years, which is hard to believe and say out loud, but probably have a pretty similar background to many of you. So worked very heavily as a volunteer with these types of funding, different types of programs, part of different review committees and application side of things. And I use the term experience because we kind of built the platform out of our own kind of poor experiences with these programs. So, looking back almost a decade now, there's kind of the manual process of grant making, which many of you probably have done before yourself, which was paper. So literally hundreds and hundreds of binders being mailed to the doorsteps of the review committees. And then for them, they have to handwrite notes and feedback and thoughts, either mail it back or they meet in person on Saturdays with other judging committee members to kind of pick and choose who the recipients might be. Probably in 2015, 2016, you saw this transition when organizations would go online. And to be frank with you, it actually probably created more work for volunteer review committee members. And the reason why I say that is because now we're using like emails and downloading of documents and spreadsheets and going to Google Drive, and with the spreadsheets, we're using formulas. And so we're using all these tools, none of which were intended for grant processing. And so it created a whole bunch of extra work for us. And then you start to hear these horror stories from organizations. So for example, there's one group that came to us and said, hey, we just wrapped up a grant application process. We awarded grant funding. And then months later, we found out that there were a handful of grant applicants who tried to apply with attachments through email and they went to a spam filter. So they literally didn't even get included in the selection process. We started getting contacted by organizations that would say, hey, you know what, we just gave out grant funding. And then in doing our due diligence, we realized that our review team actually had connections with the grantees and they made a non-biased, they made a biased review and selection process and awarded funding to their friends, right? So these are the types of experiences and things that just quite frankly can't happen. I think almost everybody on the call today is a mission-driven organization. Many of us are volunteers. And so how do we kind of do these programs the right way and give back to our communities? And so kind of full circle, the reason why I bring up the concept of a playbook is, yes, I do want to try to offer some insights and feedback in the future on, how to structure the programs, how to market them, how to do some of the accounting side of things. But at the end of the day is how do we just elevate the experience for everybody involved and let the rest of that take place on. So with that said, let's jump into the very first conversation point today. I'm going to go back just 1 second again. So we'll kind of go through what I call a proof of process, which is going to be a public statement about kind of what the process and workflow looks like. We'll get into the application side of things, not just how to structure an application process, because that's going to be very, very unique to many of you of like, what type of deliverables you're requesting or how you're doing it. But the consistency that we are going to talk about is how do you safeguard applicant information? Again, in a grant making process, especially if it's in a highly regulated industry, how do we ensure that we're safeguarding applicant information? What does a reference process look like? We'll get deeper into the selection side of things, both how you distribute grant applications to teams and to committees, but then also how do you actually do a review process that's impartial and promotes kind of an objective review and mathematic-based scoring. And the last piece of things that we're going to talk about is great. After we finish all this up, we've collected applications, we've reviewed them, we've scored them. Now we got to potentially look into grant reporting, right? How do we get some of these additional long-term data and deliverables from our grantees in a way that still follows all of the other items that we just talked about? Somebody asked questions like, we'll be sending out a presentation. Yeah, give us probably over the weekend to kind of record it and kind of get things buttoned up, but we'll send this back out And then also I like to wait a few minutes before I get into things, but we also like to tell people that we do offer a slight reduction in our pricing model for those that attend webinars. The reason why we do that is that we want to work with mission-driven organizations that are trying to better themselves, and there's no better way of doing that than webinars, right? We want to see people put forth effort and time into their program and elevate these types of things. So we do try to give back. Again, it's only available to people that attend the webinars and then end up booking a demo with us in the next 7 days. Again, I like to hold off on bringing that up because people will join and then drop off, and we don't think that's fair for them. So with that said, let's get rolling. So going back to the very first conversation point, which is going to be what I call a proof of process. This is a often overlooked and undervalued piece of a grant program. So what is a proof of process? It's a very simple public statement that basically outlines to the applicant who is applying to this program, what are the expectations and what is the expectation from them. So what ends up basically happening here, and this goes back to our years of doing this, is all these horror stories we've heard. So for example, applicants reaching out saying, hey, I didn't receive grant funding, but I know you awarded grants to XYZ, either a company or a person. I was a stronger candidate. Like, why did they get grants and not me? And without having a proof of process in place, we just kind of expose ourselves to potential compliance and risk that we don't think is necessary. And so the idea behind a proof of process is not only to protect the house, but also to elevate the experience for the applicants, providing clear transparency on what the expectations are. And so there's kind of 4 key components that go into a proof of process. And again, at a high level, basically says, hey, if you are applying to our program, this is what the process looks like. Here's our dates and our deadlines. Here's the type of application questions you're going to receive. Once we begin reviewing processes, here's kind of what that's going to look like. And then if you are selected or not selected, here's what we're going to be requesting from you, or if you're going to be sharing insights and feedback back to them. And then the entire idea is that not only do you have a proof of process, but you have a process in place that maps directly one-to-one with all those different types of deliverables or expectations. So starting out with a very simple one, it's the dates and deadlines. So we want to have some type of clear mechanism in place that applicants can kind of see, hey, what is the clear deadlines? And if I miss them, what happens? So if you're going to say you have a firm open and close date, that really means it has to be a firm open and close date. I think we in general try to be nice to people and extend deadlines or offer continuation for certain circumstances. But if we are going to say, hey, we're opening at this date and at this time, no matter what happens, that's when we're closing, which kind of lends itself to your vendor selection of how you're going to power these programs. Obviously, platforms like Reviewr have firm open and close dates. You can live and die by them, right? Like, it's going to open, it's going to close. It's like clockwork. You can have like timestamps to see and can confirm that actually happened. But if you're starting to collect things through email, like, how do you start to say, well, I sent an email, but it got stuck in a queue somewhere and it came in, 15 minutes late? Like, how do you have that conversation with somebody? How do you prove that? Or if it was postmarked a certain day, but it was received at your door at a different time, right? So having some type of infrastructure that can back that up. The other piece of that too is going to be like, what does the selection process look like? I think it's important, mostly from like a workflow management perspective, that we say, hey, if you apply to this grant, we're going to have this many phases of review. This is phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. But also working backwards and kind of thinking through, like, how much time will your team actually need? So like, these aren't just made up dates to give to people to make them happy. It really is kind of thinking through processes that's like, look, here's an example. We just did a campaign with the organization that had well over 5,000 applications. Applications ended at 11:59 p.m. and then they opened up reviewing at 12 a.m. My gut tells me that they couldn't process all the applications in time before the judging began. It became a problematic for them. So don't put yourself in those types of situations. Work backwards and figure out, like, how many applications will I receive? How many review members will I need? How long is it going to take on average for them to do the reviews? And then give yourself a little bit of a buffer. And then, of course, the last piece of this is transparency. People who apply to your program are going to want to know, like, every step of the way, like, where am I in the process? Communicate that back to me. And if you miss your deliverable timelines, they're going to be following up with you. You'd be shocked at how many people submit support requests to Reviewr saying, hey, what's the status of my application? I was supposed to be given the results. Where am I at? And we're like, sorry, like, we are the ones that are making those selections. So we just want to pass that back on to you guys, that if you're going to kind of go that deep into a proof of process for giving actual dates, deadlines, and expectations, to follow through with it. So that's at a high level. I think getting deeper into the more important aspects of a POP, and that's going to be the submission experience. So as an applicant, typically in these types of campaigns, we're dealing with not just confidential information, but people are requesting funding to fulfill a big obligation, right? These are life-changing opportunities. So with that said, the confidence levels that they have in you as a grant-making organization must reflect the proof of process. So it's all about, when I go to apply and submit my grant application or my deliverables, like, how do I even know that this portal that I'm submitting to is safe, secure, encrypted, right? Is my data being sold to different people? Who has access levels and who has privileges to accessing the submissions and the details that I'm submitting to you? So things that we like to look for at Reviewr is going to be some type of dedicated scholarship or grant management platform that's SOC 2 Type 2 compliant. Not going to get too deep into the weeds on what that compliance is, but that's kind of like the tagline or the industry standard that you're looking for. Basically saying that, hey, we appreciate you putting your trust in us as a grant making organization. We hear you. That's why we've leveraged a vendor who is equally invested in this process as we are, who's SOC 2 Type 2 compliant. They're audited. They're compliant. They have their reputation on the line as well. The data is secure, private, confidential, things like that. I also like to showcase too what questions are going to be asked. And so a lot of times grant applicants who begin these processes aren't going to have all the deliverables on hand right away. A lot of times they're going to try to see, hey, what's being requested from me? How long is it going to take me to actually do this type of stuff? And then they work offline. They start to gather the information. They work with their peers. They begin their applications. And they want to come back once they have everything prepared and done, maybe in an external platform, and then copy and paste it in. So make it easy for them to kind of have visibility on what those requirements and what that looks like. One of the things that we've started to see quite a bit of in the grant making space that was historically reserved for things like scholarships or recognition programs or even things like fellowships is references. It's easy for us to fill out these grant applications, but as a review committee, how do we start to differentiate these applications when at this point in time, everybody is so darn good at grant writing? And so the concept of a reference allows somebody else to speak on behalf of the applicant. So if we are going to be doing things like that, we want to make sure that those references get ample time to kind of dig in and submit their deliverables as well, because humans in general will procrastinate, right? So if they are going to be doing that, let's get them the request. They can start working on their references independent of the actual application itself. And then the last thing too, going back to like our compliance standards and sides of that stuff, don't be afraid to ask whatever vendor it is that you're working with, like for their SOC 2 Type 2 audit or their documentation. A lot of companies will say, yeah, for sure, we're secure, we're compliant, but they're really not. And so the documentation itself is going to be critical. Like they spent a lot of time and a lot of money getting those certifications. Let them kind of showcase that to you. So I think even more important to that is going to be the review and selection side of things. Now, there really is no right or wrong way. Let me rephrase that. There's absolutely a wrong way of doing a grant review process. But there's so many moving parts and so many workflows and so many unique ways of doing it that I think most people on this call probably already have their ducks aligned. But I want to focus on, I think, some of the core elements that we'll look at this in Reviewr, but some of the core elements that make up a really well done review and selection process that are absolutely compliant, but also do back up a proof of process. So number one is that, again, your platform of choice, your tool that you're using for the grant applications must be compliant, right? You want to make sure that you're not having confidential information being downloaded, exported, sent off to people. You want to make sure that you're not using spreadsheets or web forms or things that people can kind of just save on their hard drives. Although there are some things that people can still do, such as taking photos with their phone, at least locking them down to an extent, right? So confidential information gets submitted, it stays here. But also the kind of the confidence levels that you control user access levels. And so as you're collecting these grant applications, you as an admin or a program manager have direct control over who can see what, when, and why, right? I also want to kind of get deeper into like the workflow side of things. So what we typically like to see is multi-phase review processes. At the end of the day, it all comes down to volume. We just had a client of ours that prior to working with Reviewr actually had over 900 grant applications. And of those, they had a 7-person review committee. And every review member reviewed all 900 applications. My brain can't even wrap my head around the complexity of like, how do you even differentiate submission number like 10 versus 850? Not just how can you differentiate that, but also like how much time and energy are you giving number 850 versus number 1? So break these programs down to multi-phase, leverage some type of internal vetting process, narrow it down, advance it to a review process, and we'll get more into this stuff, but try to leverage automation that can auto vet people or auto categorize or disqualify people. Let's work within a manageable number of applications. On that note, if volume is going to be large, I also like to see us do things called like auto distribution. So take a set number of review members and auto distribute applications back out. So that ensures that your team isn't going to be overwhelmed and they have a workflow that they can manage, but also that every application is getting the exact number of reviews at random. I want to make sure that we're blinding of data. Again, I'm just kind of running through quickly here. We'll look at this in a second, but blinding of data to make sure the review team isn't viewing anything that's confidential that they should be seeing. And then also leveraging some type of tabulation. So if it is a mathematic-based scorecard, we don't want you guys crunching numbers using pen and paper, or even using Excel formulas. Let a platform kind of do the real-time selection processes for you. So with those items in mind, let's take a quick look at like what a typical application process would look like. Again, we'll start with the safeguarding of the applicant information. So I'm going to kind of showcase off to the right here what Reviewr looks like, primarily how we can kind of mimic these workflows. So when it comes to the safeguarding of applicant information, we want to make sure that we have data encryption, but also I want to touch on the compliance with global standards. Nobody at this point probably has a clear understanding of what's happening with GDPR, FERPA, California Personal Privacy Information Acts. There are so many compliances out there that your team shouldn't be focused on them. You should be focusing more on your mission and your vision and working with your grantees. Leave those to us. We're constantly monitoring in real time these ever-changing industry standards and making adaptations to the platform, make sure that we are obviously staying as the gold standard when it comes to the grant management side of things. I'm going to quickly ask a question as we go on. If anybody on this webinar is doing a reference collection, please do let me know in the chat, because I do want to spend some time on this if it is a common thing. Another kind of thing that I'll bring up too is if you have external parties submitting content on behalf of the applicant, right? So I am the grantee, I'm the one filling out the application, but I have external people also submitting content or deliverables either on my behalf or with me. Leave a quick note in the chat and we'll come back to that here in just a little bit. So let's take a quick look at what the application process looks like. So in Reviewr, everything starts with what I call a microsite. And so again, just from a pure like compliance perspective and engagement perspective, we want to leverage your existing web presence so your audience has your information, right? First and foremost, you have strong branding, strong content control. Let's let people go to your website to learn more about the program. And then from there, you're going to link to the grant platform. So I mentioned beforehand that humans in general don't read. So dates, deadlines, criteria, eligibility. So the idea behind having like a dedicated kind of landing page for the grant platform does two things. Number one is it serves as a middleman between your web presence and then the portal. But number two is it does allow you to reiterate common dates, deadlines, rules, eligibility, criteria. So within Reviewr, we have obviously a very simple landing page that we can kind of take a look at, kind of guides people through what the expectations are. As far as the proof of process goes, we actually have a dedicated section called rules or process that we can rename it to. I don't want to get too deep into that because, again, the proof of process will be somewhat unique to you guys. We have these templates that you can actually add to our sites and then kind of modify them if you'd like. We also have templates for grant applications and scoring criteria and things like that as well. But the general idea here is that people can go, they can learn about the program, and they can actually begin their grant application. Now, one of the most important aspects to a grant application is going to be this concept called a profile. And the reason why I bring this up is because there's so many moving parts with a grant application. You've got people, you've got submissions, and I use the term submissions plural because you might have like the initial grant application, but you might also have 15 or 20 additional submissions or forms being submitted down the road. You're going to have file uploads, you're going to have communication, you're going to have results, you're going to have scoring. And so the idea is that if we want to follow a proof of process, but also elevate everybody's experience, we need to take all those moving parts that I just referenced, and we need to centralize them somewhere. And so with Reviewr, that comes down to profiles. So the applicant just simply puts in who they are, and then it drops them into the submission form, which is the first step of your workflow. But again, the reason why that's important is that they can save, they can log out, they can come back later. If they are selected for a grant, that's also where they would log back in later to submit their grant reporting templates or their deliverables. Or on the polar opposite side of things, if they're not selected for a grant, that's where they would come back to receive potentially feedback. One of the things that we love to see here at Reviewr is how do we take a pool of 100 applicants and provide value to all one. Number one is adaptive workflows. So there's kind of two different schools of thought. Number one is that you might be offering grants with very specific eligibility and criteria. So don't waste people's time who are not eligible for your program. Not just don't waste their time, but also from your team's perspective, you don't want to be sifting through and vetting a bunch of applicants that aren't even qualified. So ask some type of series of questions that either based off of the results say, hey, unfortunately, you're not eligible, try again next year. Alternatively to that, we have some clients of ours that offer multiple different types of funding opportunities or multiple different types of grants. And as an applicant, they may not even know which ones they can apply for. So with Reviewr, we have these really cool, what I call eligibility quizzes. I don't know if I love that term, but an eligibility quiz where applicants can come in and they can fill out a series of questions. And then in real time, the system will read their answers and then make recommendations and say, hey, you know what, based off of what you just put into the platform, these are the 3 different grant opportunities that you're eligible for. Which of these 3 or all do you want to submit for? And then the system will read that answer and say, hey, because Kyle chose the Lennox Wilder grant, we're going to actually push him into the Lennox Wilder workflow that has different application questions. It's going to have different judging committees. It's going to have different dates and deadlines. It's going to have different scoring criteria, right? We can get hyper focused and specific on certain people with what workflows and what interactions that they have. So basically catering a very customized experience to the applicants. Again, conversely, this might have said, hey, unfortunately, based on what you just submitted, you're not even eligible. So again, how do we elevate the experience? I like to think of this like a Goosebumps book, if anybody remembers those books, where you kind of choose your own journey based off of how you're interacting with the tool. Now, once you get into the actual grant application side of things, I also want to touch on the concept of data collection. So if you can dream it up at Reviewr, we can power it. So drop downs, checkboxes, essays, file uploads, videos, spreadsheets, you name it. But I want to touch on this because there's 2 different forms of content that you're going to be collecting. Format number 1 is going to be record keeping. So who are you? What's their address, right? All these details about them. And then the second piece of content you're collecting is the content that's going to be relevant to the selection process. So don't be afraid to collect data. We don't want to over collect because, again, 2 things happen. Number 1 is it creates a barrier for applicants. So if you don't need the information, don't collect it. Number 2 is it also then pose potentially some type of risk to you by over collecting. So for example, things like social security numbers, like if you don't need it, or EINs, then just don't ask for it. With that said, at Reviewr, we have the ability to collect a bunch of data and information that doesn't get shared back out. So you can collect a whole bunch of stuff and then pick and choose very specifically which stuff we collected that you want your teams to actually have access to. So we do kind of take the data and segment it out to make sure that, it's being accessed by the right people in a way that makes sense. So obviously applicants can put in who they are, they can save, they can log out, they can come back later. I am not going to preview or talk at all about kind of the program management side of things today. Just note that within a Reviewr, you can actually get visibility on who's in progress. So who are your applicants? How far have they made it? You can send them built-in reminder messages, things like that. So moving on, as far as data collection goes, we see kind of 2 very common ways that grant applications get submitted, or a combination of both. One of which will be information inputted directly into the platform. So obviously we can ensure that if you put something confidential and secure in the system, we are encrypting it. You can have built-in character limitations. You can have countdowns. You can let the applicant know, how much progress they have remaining. But then the second form of of content that we see quite a bit of is going to be file uploads. So Reviewr file uploads are the bread and butter within the platform. As a grant maker, you're going to have probably PDFs, spreadsheets. You might even have like image files or videos. And so every document that gets uploaded into Reviewr actually gets embedded to your team's point of view as well as the review committees. So when you go to view somebody's submission, I'll show you this. You can physically view the content of it in Reviewr side by side with note-taking tools, score sheets, etc. You can even interact with the files themselves and leave communication. We hosted a webinar the other day where somebody asked about sending content back for revisions. Another great use case where you can either take somebody's entire grant application or just a file upload and send it back to them for revision and reworking. And they would then log back into the platform, resubmit it back to you. Status is changed, right? So you can kind of track who's been sent to revision, who hasn't been, who's done, things of that. There was one note that came in on the reference letter. I am going to really quickly talk about that just at a very high level. I think there's probably multiple people doing that though. So the idea behind a reference is what we call at Reviewr supplemental forms. And that term supplemental form is actually the critical piece to that, and we're going to come back to that. And it does exactly what it implies. It's additional or supplemental data capture about an applicant. And that either happens by the applicant themselves. So for example, if I get selected for a grant, I will come back in the future and I will submit a supplemental form. And that supplemental form might be a grant reporting template. It might be an impact statement, right? Additional forms that they're submitting, or it can be coming from an external person. So in the sense of a reference letter, in fact, I'm reading the note now, you said reference letter, best practices, don't do letters. So one thing that it's very challenging is A, applicants always wait till the last minute, and B, writing a letter is really challenging. If anybody's ever been asked to write a reference, you're being told to sit down from scratch in front of a blank piece of paper and write something. This is going to come off real bad, but if I was asked to write a reference on behalf of my wife, it won't be as good as whatever reference that she writes about me. And it's not that I don't love her to death. She's just a much better writer than I am. So is that a fair reflection of her as the candidate, or is it me as the writer? So with Reviewr, we have these really powerful workflows where the applicants can actually put in the first name, last name, and email as who's submitting the reference or whatever that additional form is. I've seen some grants where there's other departments that are involved as well in the grant application process. Here's another use case of that, where it would trigger an email notification to that third party, and it would say, hey, Kyle, you've been asked to write a reference on behalf of Susie. Click here to do so. And then instead of doing a reference letter, why don't we do reference templates? So like, what are the 3 to 4 things that you want every single reference to talk about? It lowers the barrier, so the reference has a much easier time answering it. Number 2 is that now you're creating consistent data. So when you go to sit down and do a review and selection process, you know that every single candidate has the same kind of content submitted about them by their different references. One's not just talking about some totally random topic in a letter, right? So that's kind of the ideal structure and workflow. We can look at more of like how do you view these later on, but again, another just great showcase and usage of the platform that has these highly dedicated tools in place. The last thing I want to talk about then is once the applications get submitted, the applicant's journey often doesn't end. So are you going to allow them to edit their applications up until deadlines? I would say most organizations will allow for editing up until like the final review period. But I also mentioned earlier that sometimes you will send this back to them for revisions. And so if that is the case, the applicants would come back, they would either edit their application, they would submit additional attachments, maybe they want to add some additional forms, maybe this is a use case where I was selected for a grant and now you want me to submit the grant reporting template. I would just go to my supplemental form section, click add new. It would ask you what type of form I want to fill out. I would choose grant reporting template. Boom, I'd fill it out right smack dab in front of me, and then everything gets centralized back into the applicant's profile. So again, kind of serving a couple of goals here. Number 1 is we're consolidating a bunch of data. Seems like a simple process, but it's not. Number 2 is we're creating this kind of communication gap between the applicants and you guys as an organization. And then number 3 is that long-term we're collecting all the information in one centralized hub. So I'm going to keep moving on. We're going to jump into some of the review pieces next and kind of creating those workflows to ensure a fair, non-biased, compliant selection. But if anybody has any comments, questions, or if they want to offer insights into their process, please do toss them into the chat and we'll come back to those. So as far as the review process goes, I think, if we have one main takeaway from today's conversation, it's going to be this. You can have the greatest application workflow in place. You can be giving out a substantial amount of money. You can give out money to every single person. But if it's not done in a meaningful way, then these programs are just not going to work. And so step number 1 is how do we create an impartial review distribution? So again, this can be done a lot of different ways, and by no means is this a simple task. Some of the clients that we work with will actually divvy out grant applications to their review teams based off of the grant opportunity itself. It might be cohorts, it might be categories of grants. but they're basically taking this big pool of grant applications and they're segmenting it down into more manageable, we'll use the term buckets. And then they have dedicated teams in charge of each one of those buckets. Now, yeah, in some cases you might be reviewing multiple buckets. That's fine, but a lot of times that's how they break it down. So Kyle's reviewing bucket number one, Tony's reviewing bucket number two, etc. That also might be phases. So you might have like an internal phase one review where review team members come in, they go through a very simple thumbs up, thumbs down, high level vetting process. From there, they move on to phase two, which is a more robust score system. Maybe additional staff are involved at that point. Phase three might be like an interview process, and then phase four might be like the final board selection of who the grant recipients might be. It's really easy for the evaluators or the review team members to get overwhelmed. So I always like to say that as you're kind of creating these workflows, put yourself in their shoes. How many applicants do you think you can physically view? How long do you think it'll take you as a review member to evaluate one? And then use that type of math to figure out like how you want to structure this. We at Reviewr provide a lot of these tools to provide the automations and make the distribution simple. But at the end of the day, this is on you to kind of figure out like who is your demographic of reviewer, how much time and energy do they have, and then coming up with what that workflow looks like. We can also get into like things like randomization. So just because you have these different types of buckets and these different types of phases, you might say from a compliance perspective that, hey, if you apply to our grant, you're going to get reviewed by exactly 3 random people. No more, no less. Or vice versa, you might say, hey, we're going to give you to an even number of review members. So the review team might get like no more than 9, but no less than 7, right? Things like that. Somebody mentioned a conflict of interest. Yeah, spot on. So and I'll show you how we would do that. But that's a great thing to keep in mind, that you might have these incredible workflows in place, but then somebody comes out to you and says, hey, I've got a conflict of interest. Or they don't fulfill their obligation. They go on vacation and they never even conduct the reviews. So now you're left with all these applicants that didn't get reviewed or couldn't be reviewed. What do you do? So at Reviewr, we have tools and mechanisms in place to manage conflicts of interest, but ultimately at a high level speaking, you need to make sure that whatever tools that you're using allows you to be adaptive on the fly, that says, hey, just because I wanted this many people to review this many applications, I now need to do these reassignments in a timely manner. I'm going to add more complexity to this because I've seen this happen so many times. Again, I don't want to get too deep into Reviewr. Yes, we can do this. But if you are doing a redistribution back out, now you got to figure out like, okay, well, who's already been reviewed? Because if I'm saying that every applicant must get reviewed by 3 different people and that applicant's been reviewed twice already, who's going to get that third, right? Or if that review member already did 2 and then it's not going to be able to do their third, who are they going to be reassigned back out? So it's not a simple thing to take over. The next piece of this is going to be creating an objective selection process. So great, we took all of our applications and we somehow divvied out to review teams, either by buckets, categorization, randomly. We avoided things like conflict of interests because they self-selected. So now how do we actually conduct the review? So number one is that we got to blind personal identifying information from their point of view. At this point in time, I just don't see any need for the review committee members to see first name, last name, email, demographic details, address, things like that. Now, I'm sure that there are corner use cases, and a lot of our clients are still showing that type of stuff. But at the end of the day, we have a grant application, and that application has some type of key metric that's being reviewed that's going to ultimately decide who's going to get funding and who's not. That key metric is what the review team should be focused on, no other additional details. The reason why I bring that up is because blinding isn't just critical to personal identifying information, it's also critical to the non-impact items. So for example, like if you have a question in your form that says, how'd you hear about us? Social media. That's probably not pertinent to the review team, right? So just don't show it to them because it's going to overwhelm them. And obviously having a dedicated scholarship and grant management software is critical because they should have all these tools in place to do everything that I just talked about. Managing conflicts of interest, doing the blinding of data automatically for you. I'll just jump the gun. How do you ensure that grant applications aren't written by AI? That's a hot topic right now. That's going to be probably our next webinar that we're going to host. If anybody's interested in that, let me know. So your tools need to make sure that they can grow with these types of requests. And then the last piece of the puzzle is, again, we've divvied them out. We've ensured that the data is blinded. Now, how do you conduct a review? I've already talked about this at a high level, doing like multi-phase review or a vetting process. But then the next piece to this is going to be the actual judging and selection, which is going to be using score sheets. There is a time and place for deliberation and having a selective review based off of like notes and people's personal feelings. But at the end of the day, there has to be some type of mathematic value that's associated with the grant application that says, yes, here's the rankings. Now, again, those rankings can change, but the idea is to use data-driven insights to do those rankings to power informed discussion. So I've seen everything from like thumbs up, thumbs down scorecards to extremely complex weighting scoring mechanisms where certain things are more relevant than others. There's no right or wrong way of doing that. But I just want to make sure that A, we're using score sheets, and then B, that you and your staff are not the ones tabulating. You'd be shocked at how many times I've heard people have these really awesome scoring parameters in place, but they mess up the Excel formula and the wrong person gets selected. I'm even going to go a step further and say that we have a concept called a normalization report at Reviewr, which is really cool because not all committee members are made equal. And so if you have your team reviewing all grant applications, this is irrelevant. But if you are having an auto distribution where maybe every applicant is reviewed by 3 separate people, what happens if you as an applicant are reviewed by just a stingy judge, right? Is that fair to you? So we actually have a really cool kind of a proprietary score sheet that will weight every judge and every applicant and creates a baseline. So it actually will take into consideration a judge's scores if they're actually just a hard ass or not. And if they are, it'll compare that application against their other ones that they've scored. So you might have a 10-point scorecard. This judge never gets more than a 3. So just because you got a 3 isn't a bad thing. You actually got the best score that judge ever gave. So let's take that into consideration. So what does that look like? Let's review what that workflow looks like. So again, we talked about a couple moving parts here. So I'm going to start with the actual distribution of submissions to review teams. So again, with Reviewr, you have to provide access levels, right? Everything is proprietary. There's confidential data being passed back and forth. You need to know who is looking at what. So you will either add or import your team into the platform. And then once they're in the system, step number 1 is create those review phases. So I'm going to kind of give you 2 different examples that can be used in conjunction with one another. If you're an organization that gives out multiple grants, here's kind of that bucketing system I talked about where you have basically 1 bucket per grant opportunity. This could also be done by like levels of review. So phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. It might be spring versus fall application periods. It could be location based. At the end of the day, we're basically saying, hey, look, based off of all the applications we received, we're going to put them into some type of review bucket. So in this example, I have the Lennox Wilder grant. What I would next do is give that to a team. So whenever Simon, Paula, Mark, and Judge Judy come into Reviewr, they're only going to have access to the applicant in the Lennox Wilder grant. Now, in this use case, you can see that these committee members are actually part of multiple different buckets. That's great. So when they log into Reviewr, they're going to see Lennox, Carson, and Brooke, but not finalists, right? So you're getting at a high level this kind of like a holistic pairing concept. But what if you want to go deeper? So I'm going to go ahead and open up my bucket. And this is where the magic really hits the road. So it'll actually show you a listing of every grant applicant that you've received, how many people are in charge of reviewing that grant application, and who those individuals are. So if you are doing random distribution, it's literally as simple as bulk selecting people and saying, hey, let's give each application no less than 4, but no more than 6. Or let's give everybody exactly 3. Or you can also do it on the flip side. And the system does recognize the review pairings as well. So it's not going to give just one judge a whole bunch, but somebody else a whole little. It'll equally distribute things out. But you could say, hey, for the sake of time, like my committee has told me that they can't look at more than 15. So you can set a max that says, hey, no judge gets more than 15 submissions to review. Going back to the question earlier on the conflict of interest. So typically what's going to happen is, well, I would actually say 2 things. Depending on what data you're collecting, you may first want your review committee to fill out a virtual NDA. So just a quick e-signature that says, hey, this is proprietary, confidential. We have templates of this. Then once they get into the platform, they basically need to say, hey, I have a conflict of interest, yes or no. If yes, then they move on. They can't review the application. If no, then they move on to actually conducting the review. So in this example, What happens if Mark Cuban here says, hey, you know what? Like, I'm golfing buddies with Gabrielle's father. I can't review her, or I serve on her board. What you would simply do is it would flag Gabrielle as a conflict of interest, and then we can just unassign and then reassign somebody back out. So big picture, we have all these applications coming in that are being sent out to the review team. Middle ground is that we can start to do random auto distributions. And then super fine detail, if you wanted to, is you have one-to-one control over which review members are reviewing which applications and when and how. So great, we have assigned these grant applications to our team. Now let's actually conduct a review. So when the grant review committee comes into a platform like Reviewr or whatever tools you're going to use, it's critical that it's very user-friendly, because the degradation of the review process pretty much falls off a cliff after a certain number of hours. Like, you just are not going to give the same attention to number 15 as you gave to number 1. So when the review team comes into a tool, they have to be hyper specific, hyper focused, and on the task at hand. So in Reviewr, they basically get a menu that says, hey, look, here's who you need to look at. By no means is Reviewr blurry. This little blurred section is my way of trying to showcase and show you that we are able to blind the data. It just wouldn't actually show up there. So when you go ahead and open up a grant application, it'll show you off to the side the entire grant portfolio. Again, you'll notice things like first name, last name, demographic details. All of that stuff can get hidden from the reviewer's point of view. But the idea here is that your review team has basically all the content and deliverables that they need to make informed decisions side by side with their note-taking and their score sheets. Now, score sheets, again, are completely custom. I've seen everything from thumbs up, thumbs down, good, great, ugly, sad face, smiley face, to really complex weighted scoring systems that take into consideration like standard deviations. The goal here, though, and don't do that, like, don't overwhelm your review team. Like, less is more when it comes to score sheets. But the review team will simply side by side view the grant application, fill out their score sheet. They can toggle back and forth between the application form, the file uploads. They can go to their note-taking tools, and then once they're done, they can submit the scores. And then in real time, the system is going to go ahead and kick out the results. And it's going to tell you from high to low every single applicant that was reviewed, who reviewed them, how they were scored, and averages. So the system basically gives you this leaderboard that shows you in real time the results. I say real time because you also need to monitor of your judging committee, like who's done, who's not done, who's in progress. So for those of you that have a multi-phase process, typically you can just take your average scores, take like your top 3 or whatever that number looks like, and then advance them to phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. For others, this interface is extremely powerful for deliberation. I do try to steer a little bit away from that because it does kind of start to open up biases with review processes, because no longer does the math tell the whole story. But you can actually pull this leaderboard and say, hey, you know what? Like, number 2 is Sheldon on this list, but Mark, you gave it a 12. Judge G, you gave it a 31. If you're not using our normalization report, let's let the 2 of them deliberate and hash out and talk about why they review people the way that they did, and then you can modify the results. So Reviewr doesn't tell you who the winners are. We give you the data to make informed decisions off of it. I want to show you one last thing that kind of goes back to the application side of things while we're in here. As I'm doing that, the question that came in about giving reviewers optional times for like dates and deadlines of when they're going to be available. So I love to see judge recruitment forms or reviewer recruitment forms. So it's a high-level form that they're going to fill out that's like, who are you, what's your address? Because I think there's probably some high-level data that you want from them, when they can conduct the reviews, what their workload capacity looks like. We work with, obviously, like, say, for example, like a science foundation. Well, is there a certain field of study that you're an expert in? That way you can start to not only pair up your review applicants by grouping, but also by expertise, right? So fill out this judge recruitment form and then use that to kind of power your decision-making matrix of who's going to be reviewing who and when. Let's go back to the applications, I think. So I touched on 2 things earlier. One was the embedding of documents, again, and then number 2 was those references. So in Reviewr, you basically get a very similar style menu where you can see all of your grant applicants. If I open somebody up, we basically took the concept of a binder and we virtualized it. So we have Leslie here. She's a grantee. This would show us all of Leslie's information. I want to touch on, again, communication. So I didn't talk much about this earlier, but I talked about like compliance. One thing that we also want to see you avoid doing is don't send confidential data through email. So within Reviewr, at least, you can leave kind of internal notes and communication that would trigger a notification that would say, hey, Leslie, you have communication waiting for you. Click here to access it. And then she would have to come into the portal to actually see that communication because we don't want it transmitted via email that could get intercepted or blocked or put into spam, right? So the idea is that you can kind of come back into the tool set. I also wanted to preview really quickly the embedded document viewer. So this is great for a couple different reasons. So the main reason why I wanted to pull this up was the grant deliverables. So grant reporting templates, impact statements, things like that. Once people are selected for a grant, there's a strong likelihood that you're going to need more information from them. For example, we work with some cities and municipalities who received like America Rescue Plan, ARPA grants back in like 2020. And for them, if you got selected for a grant like from the federal government, you actually have to come back into Reviewr once every month for 5 years. Every month for 5 years and submit a template. So for them, they'll do one of two things. They'll go to their attachment section and then just click upload attachment, right? That's that month's reporting template. It could be their financial statements, whatever those deliverables look like. Then from your point of view, you can actually press view and you can view those documents right in Reviewr. You can leave comments on them, you can leave notes on them, but ultimately the idea is that we don't want you to have to download things, then go use other tools. The other thing I wanted to showcase was those references, or this is probably the more desirable way of having grant reporting templates filled out, is that in this case, we have Ann Perkins. So Ann was asked to write a reference on behalf of Leslie. So she would have gotten an email notification that said, hey, Ann, click here to write a reference on behalf of Leslie. She then clicks on a link and then she fills out a form because again, I hate reference letters. I like reference templates. So here's an example of what Ann filled out. So here's those 3 questions. And yes, of course, she could still upload a file if you want her to do so. But the idea is that we have 10 or 15 of these happening. They all get centralized in your applicant's profile. Going back to grant reporting templates, what would end up happening is Leslie would come in here, and instead of having an external request from Ann, she would simply click add new. And then the system would say, well, what are you trying to submit? Because you can control those parameters. You might have a very controlled environment that I need this, 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 and that for my grant applicants. They would just simply click on which one they want to submit. Form pops up, they fill it out, and they submit it. And then it basically becomes a line item in this interface. And then when your team is ready to access it, you press view, and then boom, there it is. So going back to those ARPA grants, they literally will have one line item per month for 5 years. So this would be like January, February, March. Lines for requested submissions. So yeah, there's kind of 2 pieces to that. So everything in Reviewr is deadline based. So every application, every submission its own dates and deadlines, as well as the review processes and different workflows. And so the system will basically read the deadlines that are put into the system and say, hey, can this be submitted, yes or no? If so, it also checks statuses and permissions and things like that. With the question about the dates and deadlines, and I apologize if I didn't spend much time on that answer, because there's so many moving parts to a grant process. You have the initial submission, you got deliverables and files, you have multiple phases and rounds, and then you have additional people, right? You have other people maybe submitting on your behalf. So ultimately, like, yes, each one of them can absolutely have different dates and deadlines on them. And then kind of reading your question more further on this one. So yeah, so you're asking the documents that you may ask after the grant award, such as organizations, yearly financial. So with those supplemental forms, the applicant would come in and it would basically say like, we need a insurance certificate or a financial audit or whatever it is. Each one of those can have its own window of when you're collecting them, as well as kind of required fields. And then once it's been submitted, then they would move on to the next. You can actually kind of ask very specific deliverables from people based off of the different workflows that they're in. Speak briefly on year-to-year memory and pre-populating data for applicants. Yeah, great question. On top of that too is integrations with CRM. So yeah, Reviewr can do quite a few different integrations. We just have to better define like what those integrations are and with who. But to answer your question directly, so it's quite common that you have repeat users. And so we want to lower the barrier for them, but also present the opportunity to conduct clean, fresh, updated data. So a very common workflow is when a repeat applicant comes back in, it would say, hey, you want to fill this out from scratch, or do you want to pre-populate this from a prior submission? If they say, you know what, I want to pre-populate from a prior submission, the system will say, great, which submission do you want to pre-populate from? Because they might have multiple. And then it's going to say, of the data on that submission, which elements do you want to pre-populate? So they might just choose name, email, address, but everything else they want to start from scratch. Now, with that said, you control which elements are even available. So maybe you don't even want to offer them the ability to submit like new essays. You want them to only be able to submit or only submit new essays, but they can only modify like their name and address. You can kind of control. Really appreciate everybody's time today. Keep an eye out and looking forward to the next one. Have a good one, everyone.